And please bear with my slowness a bit today. I'm a bit strong, but the devil is a liar. We are here and nothing can stop it. Thank you, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I've been looking forward to this for a very, very long time. So, a bit of backstory before we start, right? Eniola Lahomi, I've been following her since 2017, that long. For those that have read the book, the part where I talked about GTB and learning about early intervention and things, that was really where I met Eniola. The way she talks, she's very soft-spoken, no, not like me. Oh. She's very soft-spoken, but don't let her calm voice deceive you. She's loaded. I've since 2017, I've been following her journey. Anytime I see that she's on the GTB event, I follow her. In fact, I tried to even get her to be my son's speech therapist, but her calendar was too booked. But thankfully, God provided another way. Then fast forward around last year when the whole book idea came up, and I knew I was going to do a community event on the 15th of February. I went to go and stalk her again, not even knowing she had moved to the UK. Maybe I saw she had moved to the UK. I was like, I have to get her to attend this. I said, if there's one professional that I know that is consistent, you know. So I reached out to her. She tried everything she could to join us for the event, but she couldn't. But here she is. And sorry, I'm setting you up for our next community event next year. By the grace of God, you are going to come and join us. So thank you so much for joining. We are just My name is Eniola Oyegunle. You know me. I wrote a book about my son's journey, and since I wrote that book in December, we have a community called Traveling Beyond the Label, which is a family, which is I call we are family really, which is a family of other families, parents and carers are in that group. We come together to share knowledge, emotional support. Having a support system is very important. And within our community, we understand the role of professionals, even though we know some professionals have not really met our expectations, but we believe that there are good people out there. So we believe in learning from professionals, and that's why we have events like this to share knowledge. And in the beginning of March, we had Blessing, as a parenting coach, who came and talked to us about parenting strategies and resources. At the beginning of the week, as Neurodiversity, we had a pediatrician. So it's so befitting to have you here. And thank you so much for joining us. So, without wasting too much of your time, the structure of the meeting today, like I mentioned before, I'll just to set the tone, I'll ask you a few questions, then I'll throw it open for the Q&A session from the audience. So the
Okay.
first question I'll be asking is just so that you can introduce yourself to us. Can you just tell us briefly about yourself and your role as a speech and language therapist?
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Eniola as well, and I'm a speech and language therapist. I've been a speech and language therapist since 2012. But before being a speech and language therapist, I was sort of a behavior analyst. So I've worked with children with developmental disabilities, language problems since 2010. So that's been my journey. I've been working in the sort of field of autism and other developmental disabilities as well. As a speech and language therapist, our role is to work on communication. So I've deliberately said communication because that's what we do. We're not only just looking at speech and talking, we're looking at communication as a whole and the different means of communication. And we will be looking at what's suitable for the child that's in front of us, how we can facilitate that communication, how we can get that going. Communication involves not just the output, not just the expression, which can come in form of like speech or with using pictures or with signing, but also that understanding element as well. So a speech and language therapist will look at all those elements of communication. So the speech is, the actual sounds of the language that you use. For most of us, I'm assuming English, so that the speech is looking at those sounds that make up the language, while the language is looking at the elements of the language, like the grammar, the understanding, the vocabulary. Those sorts of elements are what we would term as language. We would also look at areas such as stuttering, thinking about voice and prosody and things like that. And we also work on swallowing difficulties as well. So that's, in a nutshell, I think, the role of a speech language therapist when it comes to sort of children with developmental difficulties. And we also sometimes double as counselors, because we do spend lots of time with parents, and we are able to sort of share some advice and recommendations with parents as well. So that I will say, in a nutshell, is the role of the speech language therapist. And please
Okay.
confirm that you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Please just thumbs up or thumbs down, or
Okay.
just give some emotions. I want to assume they can hear you. Let's not assume. Okay, yes, they
Wonderful.
said they can hear you. Yeah,
Okay.
that's great. Thank you so much for that. So I think with that on the way, I'm just ready to just dig in so that I don't want to use all the time we have. So a big portion of our community we have children that are young, like
Okay.
from that age 3 and above kind of age.
Mm,
So how would you, as if you remember the thing that drew me to you, that topic about early intervention and and things like that. So how would parents be able to distinguish between, because when we spoke to the pediatrician, she was saying sometimes delayed milestones can be very tricky to interpret, because what we term as delay might not be what medically is called delay. So
mm.
how would parents be able to distinguish between a child actually being delayed and a child that has like a speech challenge?
Okay. So, I mean, we will term, so for, we have children who we would call late talkers,
Mhm.
or children that just start using the language a little bit later. If a child is just a late talker, so we're looking at the fact that the only difficulty that they're experiencing is with their speech and language usage, and everything else is sort of following the normal pattern. So they're walking when they're supposed to walk, they're playing with other children how they're supposed to play with other children. There's no issues with learning, there's no issues with sort of forming those social bonds. There are no maybe gross and fine motor issues. These are not our children who are having difficulty coordinating their behaviors or having really particular interests. It's just everything else is going fine, but for some reason the language just maybe being a little bit slow. But when we start to think about children who are having some difficulties or some delays in other areas apart from just their speech and language, that tells us that something else is going on, and we should be, maybe even when it's just late talking, we should be seeking help as well when it comes to a certain time. So for example, you have a 3-year-old that's not saying anything at all. That is now a really significant delay, because we do expect that by 12 months, that's by a year, children have already started using up to 50 single words. So if your child is 3 and they're not using any words at all, that's telling us that there's something, this is quite a significant delay. And if a child is at that stage, it's very, very unlikely that the only problem is just with the talking. You'll be seeing a lot of other difficulties. So that's when we start to say that this is quite a significant delay, or maybe even a disorder. But we typically won't wait until the child is 3. So there's some markers that we would look out for. Even a child as little as 6 months old should be reciprocating some kind of facial, when you like look at your baby, smile, the baby should be mirroring back some of those things. The baby should be expecting to see, let's say they've dropped something, they should not just forget about it. They should be expecting that something is going to happen. Maybe someone will pick it up. They should be able to engage in some social games, like you do peekaboo with a baby, they're laughing, they're engaging. Those are sort of the building blocks of social interaction and turn taking that we would expect to see. By the time that they're 1, even though they don't have a lot of words, we expect that they're pointing to specific things, not necessarily dragging people's hands to it, but they're able to point at something, and specifically that's something that they want. So we would be looking out for other things as well, and won't just wait until they're 3. But sometimes it can be quite tricky, especially if this is your first child and you don't know what to expect. But usually, by the time the child starts to interact with other children, there's usually that instinct that tells you something's not quite wrong. They're not maybe playing like everyone else, or they're not talking as much as everyone else. So, those sort of things cue us into the fact that there is something going on.
That's fantastic, and it just brings me back to my. I'm still reliving a lot of such experiences, doing it 2 times over. Okay. You see, thank you so much for that, Eniola.
Mm.
In this part of the world, even many parents are very quick to identify some of these signs,
Yeah,
and they try their best to try and get help, but because of the waiting list, the how long it takes for anybody to even take you serious,
yeah.
I think it's very necessary to give while we're waiting,
Mm,
and also not everybody can afford to pay for these services out of pockets. There are some families like mine that had to incur sort of things. Let me not go into that just because you feel like you have to do something.
mm.
What strategies would you say, or what kind of practical activities can we do to encourage this speed development while we are waiting for the medical intervention?
Okay, so now there's lots of things that we can do. Usually my first sort of point of call is just start to get to know your child a little bit better outside of what you think is wrong. There's still a child in there that has their personality. There's still a child in there that has some interest in something. So my point, my starting point is usually because sometimes I'll get like parents and children in therapy, and my first session, want to do the assessment, and I say to the parents, just sit on the mat or sit wherever and have a play with your child. And then usually the parents will say, "What's this? What's this? What's this? What's that?" Then the child doesn't respond. Then, they may say, "Clap your hands." Then the child maybe starts running away, and then the parent is at a loss for what else to do.
Mm,
So the thing is, if you have a really young child, you have to really start to get into that habit of playing, but a very deliberate playing. You have a child that's not using a lot of words. That's not the time to start asking questions. What's this? Show me this. Point to this. What's this? What's this? What's this? What's this? Because you're just setting that child and yourself up for frustration, because you feel like you should know this now. This cup that you use every day, you should be able to say cup, but then they're not saying it, or they're running off. So I would usually start with just having a playtime.
mm,
What, when you do this playtime, it's best to follow the child's interest. So let's say your child's really interested in trucks or cars, or I don't know, stuffies, whatever it is. Just get one of that thing and sit down with your child 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, if that's what your child can tolerate, and just start commenting on what you're doing.
mm,
Our children need to hear that language a lot more so that they can have a chance to imitate it. They need to hear it in as simple a version as possible. So let's say your child's really interested in cars, and you take a car and start playing with the child. If you play with a car for 10 minutes, there's only so much you can say.
mm,
Vroom, vroom, car, go up. You're going to repeat yourself over and over again. And it's that repetition that we need. Your child's not going to find it silly. It's you that may think, I've been saying this since they may be bored. But children, you can be playing one.
mhm,
When you meet a child and say, "Carry me," you carry them up once. You do it twice, then they can be there, wanting you to do the same thing 50 times. So children need that repetition. So you can start, first identifying their interests. And if you don't know what their interests are, try different things.
mm,
Lots of cause and effects things hold our children's attention. Bubbles are usually a great place to start. A lot of children are interested in bubbles. By the time you blow a bubble, there's only so much you can say. Bubble, pop, big bubble, small bubble, look, catch. You're going to repeat yourself over and over again. You want to be as engaging as possible while commenting. That commenting is really important, because it's from that commenting that is giving the child that understanding to know that this round thing is the thing that's called bubble. Not go and bring that big bubble, go and see that bubble there. Then they don't know what that thing is the thing go with X and C, but you're just repeating the same short phrases or single words over and over again. Commenting is a really great way to start, and then following your child's lead.
Mm,
If you've brought car in and they don't want to play with car and they start fixating on a shoe, just start
mm,
playing with the shoe. It's not like we must play with the bubble today. We have brought bubble, If they start playing with the shoe, that thing is holding their interest at that particular time. Oh, daddy's shoe, big shoe. Let's wear the shoe. And we jump in the shoe, jump, jump, jump. You start playing with the shoe. By the time you play with that shoe for 2 minutes, you've said shoe like 50 times. And the more you continue to do that and repeat the same activities over and over again, the more the children get the language. When you're doing things that you do every single day, such as getting dressed, every time you get dressed, try to say the same things.
mm,
You're putting on a shirt. Oh, look, shirt. Let's put on shirt. One arm, two arm. If every time you're putting on a shirt, you start with one arm, two arm, or over the head, and that is what you say every single morning. By the time you say one arm, you may get to the stage where the child may say other arm, or even if they don't say other arm, they start to anticipate. If you say one arm and you don't say anything again, they start to look like, and then okay, at least some understanding is taking place. We're starting to get through. But that commenting is necessary, giving our children as much words as we can. You can also do things like reading a book. Even if your child is not reading, it doesn't matter. Getting books that have pictures, very little words. Even if they have words, forget about the words. Share them things in the book. Oh, look, it's yellow. Big this, big that. Be as animated and, as exciting as possible to try to hold their interest. But the big thing I always stress is find what interests your child and then start to use that. A lot of our children have very limited interest, but they can stay with those interests for a really long time. So it's no use trying to make them interested in writing number two if all they
mm.
want to do is play with bubbles, or if all they want to do is build blocks. We can get so much more language in there instead of saying, hold the pencil now, draw, and then creating that frustration or tension. So again, when we start to do the Q&A, if people have really specific questions about their own situations, then we can talk a little bit more about that.
I mean, like Eniola, you have just hit the nail on the head. Like what you have just told us is consistent with everything that a lot of people say and what many of us have learned to put in practice. Like it was a spirit therapist that I was working with my second son that made me realize the importance of music to my second son. And it's through incorporating music that he was able to gain language. Everything that we were teaching him, we put it in a tongue. It's bath time. It is bath time. It sounded like an animator every time.
Yeah.
But that was how he was able to gain language and doing it consistently. So many tips you have given us. Thank you so much for that. Um, you know, this idea about language, you picked on it as well, communication, not just only verbal, the body language and things like that, eye contact and things like that are things that we can use for communication. We still have quite a number of children that people call non-verbal. I don't like that language, but we are where we are. They call those kind of individuals or children non-verbal. What's your view on in terms of these children or these individuals that are called nonverbal? Is there How do you know whether a or an individual will speak later in life, or if that individual, or I don't know how to say it. How is there a way to distinguish individuals or children that don't have the ability to speak at all from those that can develop language later on in life? Is there a way to distinguish that?
It's quite interesting. I get asked this question so many times, and what are the signs that my child is actually going to talk? Or the short answer is we can't say for sure.
Mm,
But so many things come into play. The earlier you get in there and start making a habit of communication, the better it is.
mm,
The earlier you lose sight of they must talk, they must talk, they must talk, the better usually the outcomes are.
mm,
I say that because while we're starting to fixate on maybe this child must speak, this child must speak, we sort of lose out on other opportunities that we have for interaction and for engagement. So,
mm,
a couple of things. I mean, if we want to look at the research, it will tell us things like it depends on the cause of the delay. For
mm,
example, if it's, sometimes a really severe form of autism, one of the hallmarks of severe autism is that the children won't go on to then speak or be verbal, as the term is. If it's really severe traumatic brain injury that has affected the speaking centers of the brain, we wouldn't expect to sort of see speech later on. But in terms of, a classic diagnosis of autism or a classic diagnosis of Down syndrome or, other related difficulties, it's hard to say. But usually when we start to intervene early, we do see some signs that our children are going to speak. But I mean, I'm a big advocate for early intervention, but it doesn't mean that if your child has passed 5, there's no hope and they're never
mm,
going to speak.
mm,
I've worked with some kiddies who start to use their language at 7 and 8, sometimes even 10,
mm,
and they start to use maybe some single words at age 10. But usually, if a child is going to speak, we start to see some imitation going. Okay, so sometimes we may see some echoing, what we would term like echolalia. So you say
mm.
something and they say it back,
Okay.
or you're playing some games with them and they're anticipating. Maybe there's something you always say. For example, maybe you always sing, roll, roll, roll your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. And sometimes you sing that, if you see a crocodile, don't forget to scream, ah! And maybe you've gotten to that, if you see a crocodile, and you don't say anything, and the child is sort of trying to scream or trying to get you to say something. So usually with children that will speak, we see more of some social interaction. We see more of the child wanting to come out of their world and engage. We do have some of our children who just really, really prefer to be in their own world.
Mm,
There's no such desire to want to come out and engage. And with autism, that's really a hallmark of it. So we have to be quite intentional about getting that engagement going. That's why I say sometimes we focus so much on the speaking and say apple, say apple. But there are other things that we can start to do. Get them playing with other children, get them playing with their siblings. If they don't have any siblings, get them playing with you. Something as simple as passing a ball, starting to have that awareness of other people. So we do see that children who engage socially, who engage more socially, we would say usually they have better outcomes in terms of speaking. But again, truly, truly, I know it sounds like why shouldn't it be? But speaking is not the be all and
mm,
end all of everything. Usually, I would say to my parents, as young as your children are, just have the word independence at the back
mm,
of your mind. How are we working towards independence? How is this child going to be able to live a functional life? Speaking is not a barrier to living a
mm,
functional life. Communication is a barrier to living a functional life. So we want to be as open as possible to whatever means of communication that our children are going to use. And starting to use pictures or signing doesn't mean that your child wouldn't talk. It doesn't mean that that's the end of it. We've given up. It's just putting that communication across so that we start to avoid problem behaviors as they
mm.
grow older.
That's perfect. And I like the way, and that leads me into the last question I have for you. Then we'll throw it open.
Mm,
The benefit of the digital age we're in right now is that there are a lot of technological advancements and tools, things
mm,
like assisted technology and all those things that have been available, you know, that people can now use. So what's your view on that? Because you touched on it towards the end,
mm.
because a lot of people feel like if their child is it gets stuck or gets involved in using AAC devices, they might not speak or they might not have the desire to want to
Mm.
use their words. What's your view on that?
I mean, I just like to point out that for everybody, for every individual, speaking is the easiest means to get your message across.
Mm,
So if a child is not speaking, it's not because they've just decided, I want to frustrate everybody in my life, I will just
mm,
keep quiet. It's because for whatever reason, they're finding it difficult to. And the moment they find it easy to, they will.
mm,
So the AAC or whatever you've put in place is not going to be a barrier to that, because it's more stressful for your child to get the iPad, start putting in something than to just say, water, give me
mm,
water. They're going to do, if it's easy for them to do so, they're going to go ahead and use speech. So using a device or an alternate means of communication is not going to, in fact, it's going to help, because once they see, and when we use any sort of AAC with our children, we always still pair it with speech.
mm,
Example, if I'm using a low tech AAC, like for example, a picture exchange,
mm,
if a child gives me a picture of crisps, I'm not just going to collect the picture.
mm,
I'm going to say, oh, crisps, you want crisps. And if it's something that they ask for all the time, and every time they bring that picture, I'm saying crisp, I'm telling them that this thing that you're requesting is called crisps.
mm,
And the moment it's easier for them to say crisp, believe you me, they'll throw that picture away
mm,
and start saying crisps. I've worked with children where we go through the first phase of the PECs, the second phase of the PECs, the third phase of the PECs. By the time they've gotten to phase three, they've heard this word that they've been requesting for over and over again. And after a while, they just don't use the picture anymore because they now know the word and they're able to say the word. I may see that sometimes when they are struggling, or maybe they want to request for something new, they may then go back to their communication book or go back to their device because maybe they don't know the word for that. And then they go back to their books. But the moment it's easy for our kids to speak, they will speak. So it's not a matter of I can speak, but I just feel like I will not speak. I'll just close my mouth. So it's not a matter of that. So I will encourage. But the thing with AACs is we've got to be quite careful because there are tons of things on the market. A lot of it are just marketing and just saying, buy this app, and then all of a sudden your child will start talking. So you do want to seek some guidance when you're exploring some of these apps, and they will still need to be taught. So it's not just a matter of there's an app that is, picture to speech, and all of a sudden you give your child the iPad and like magic, boom, they just know how to use it and they're pressing. So they still have to be taught. We still have to show them. We still have to model how to use those things. But I would, encourage us to be as open as we can to whatever means that our children take to communicate, and just have in mind that that's not a barrier for them actually getting to speak. And I know we sometimes we don't like to think about it, but as a speech and language therapist, I do put that thought in my mind that if they don't eventually speak, I don't want to end up with a 16-year-old and I would have been saying, oh, now they're hitting everybody, they're pinching everybody because they can't get their message across, when we could have given them a message, a way to
mm,
be able to communicate.
mm. I mean, I think I think that sets the tone for us. I mean that we've said so much, and I think we need to marinate. We need to go and reflect on that. So I'm going to stop the live recording now because I want you to be free. I want people to be free to ask questions.
Mm.
Thank you. We've set the scene now, so we can